Alright, get ready, cause this is a crazy story. It's July 1951. A New Orleans resident, John C. Painter, goes on a chance trip to Denver, Colorado. While there, he bumps into a man named Freddie Dickerson, a name Painter doesn't know. And yet, he immediately recognizes this man as his old friend Sam Jones from back in New Orleans. There's just one problem with all of this, which is Sam Jones was supposed to be dead. Okay, flashback to March 11th, 1949. Sam Jones worked as a night attendant at a service station. As the story goes, he plotted with his co-worker, Donald Easterwood, to pull a robbery. It was to be a somewhat classic inside job. Jones and Easterwood would, quote, rob their own service station, claim somebody else did it, and then pocket the cash. It was the kind of crime one could fairly easily pull off during this time. There was a falling out during the process of sorting out the money they got, which totaled roughly $110. Donald Easterwood would later walk into the town marshal's office in Gretna, just across the river from New Orleans, and admit to the crime that they'd committed. He claimed that a third man, 52-year-old Ernest Howard, was also involved in the robbery, and that, at the height of their disagreement, Howard stabbed Jones to death. Either this was how it happened, or Easterwood was coming forward right away so he could throw Howard under the bus for the crime. He said they then took Jones's body out to a swamp somewhere in Jefferson Parish, and just left it there. The body would be recovered from that site weeks later. Multiple stab wounds on the body seemed to vindicate Easterwood's story. The pants worn by the victim also had a laundry tag marked with Jones's previous address, and he was personally identified by his then common-law wife, Patricia Land. Easterwood would be arrested on the spot, and when Howard was tracked down a couple weeks later, he too was arrested. He denied any involvement in the crime. But regardless, it appeared both he and Easterwood were going to be put on trial for murder. That is, until August when, right there in his jail cell, Ernest Howard dropped dead of a heart attack. So all that was left was Donald Easterwood to prosecute. It was then that he quickly began changing his tune, once he finally went on trial, claiming his confession was forced, that the Gretna police chief, Beauregard Miller, punched, kicked, and threatened to kill him if he didn't confess. Again, he may have thought Howard would go down for the crime, while he got a slap on the wrist. But now he was the only man left to blame. The witnesses at trial did not help clarify this matter, with some saying the confession was coaxed and others saying it wasn't. Easterwood's wife also testified that he was with her all night on the evening of March 11th, which certainly could have been a lie. On the flip side, Patricia Land testified that she personally saw Easterwood kill Jones, which was intriguing as this put her at the crime scene as well. But it appeared the jury ultimately believed Easterwood when he said the confession was beaten out of him. He was a family man with children who'd been railroaded by a local police force looking for a fall guy. In the end, the jury was out less than 30 minutes before coming back with a not guilty verdict that included the stipulation that Easterwood's family be provided $100 for the hardship they had faced. And just to further vindicate his innocence, His attorney would then file suit against Police Chief Miller for the brutality that his client supposedly faced. And that was it. The case was closed and generally forgotten. But we still had a man found dead in a swamp. If Easterwood's confession was not genuine, then how did he know Jones was left in that swamp? Or did the police just fabricate that after Jones's body was found? If they were desperate for a suspect, the fact that Easterwood was co-workers with Jones may have been enough of a connection to put the finger on him. It also seems like if Easterwood knew right where the body was, it wouldn't have taken several weeks to find it. Granted, we are talking about the rural lands outside of New Orleans, where swamps are in abundance. Regardless what happened, we did have a case of murder with one suspect dead and the other acquitted, never to be tried again. It may have been easiest for some to just assume the dead Ernest Howard was responsible, but otherwise, we had a murder case wherein the victim had yet to receive justice. Imagine being John Painter, mourning the loss of a friend brutally murdered and discarded in a swamp like so much trash, only to see that dead man walking in Denver, Colorado. While they may have been friends, Painter returned to New Orleans and immediately told authorities that he had seen Sam Jones, alive. The jig was up, and Jones returned to the Big Easy, admitting his involvement in the robbery over 2 years earlier. But when it came to the murder, he was clueless. How did his common-law wife identify the victim as him? Why was the victim wearing pants that Jones had obviously owned at one point? And most incriminating, why did Jones split town right after the robbery? Certainly, if he'd only committed the robbery, that might be reason enough to split town. But was his real reason due to something worse? Authorities theorize that the man found in the swamp may have been Freddie Dickerson, the alias Jones was using in Denver. When Jones returned to New Orleans, he had a Social Security card with Dickerson's name on it. Jones claimed that he had found the card while traveling through Oklahoma City and, I guess, decided to pick up that identity. I don't know about anybody else, but I practically never believe the whole, "oh, I just found it" explanation for oddities such as this. And the card also could have just been a forgery. Trying to look up the name, Freddie Dickerson, in New Orleans, the only thing I found was a small piece about a man under that name being dismissed on charges of disturbing the peace. But this small article was from February 1952, long after the murder. So this particular man couldn't have been the victim, but he could have been the actual source of Sam Jones's Social Security card. But in my gut, I still think it was probably a forgery. With these new revelations, the sympathy and certainty of Donald Easterwood's innocence back in 1949 was immediately forgotten when it became clear that the body recovered in the swamp was not Sam Jones. He was arrested once again, which seemed a bit hasty as, without so much as an identity for the murder victim, how could Easterwood be tied to his murder at all? The only thing that could tie him to it would be his confession, which the previous jury believed was coerced. But he would not be the only one to come under fire this time around. An effort was quickly established to find Patricia Land. How could she have identified the wrong man as her common-law husband? Furthermore, how could she have testified in court that she witnessed Sam Jones getting murdered? She had clearly not been honest, but why? Had she known that Sam had just up and run away? If so, wouldn't she have reported this, considering the fact that he'd completely abandoned her? Maybe she wasn't one to hold a grudge. Or maybe she really was defending him. The next bombshell came shortly after Jones came to town. After shrugging when the notion of a murder came up, he changed his story, not to an admittance of murder, but to an admittance of an accident. It's hard to say if this encounter was directly related to the robbery or not, but Jones claimed that while at the service station, a man arrived on the scene, armed with a knife. A confrontation ensued, sparked by an argument over Jones's common-law wife. When the two began to struggle, Jones pushed the man to the ground, wherein he fell on his own knife and killed himself. Jones also admitted to helping take the body to the swamp, but would later repudiate this claim. He also stated that he did not know this man's name, which seems kind of unlikely to me. Is it possible that Patricia Land knew Jones had a fight with one man and wanted to then save him by switching the details up and saying Jones was the one who was stabbed? I guess with the knowledge that he was going to split town? Whatever the case, a confession that should have helped clear matters up only complicated things further. It still suggested Patricia Land committed perjury back in 1949. The body recovered, again, had several stab wounds. How did a man falling once on his knife manage to stab himself several times? It seemed like everyone in this case was lying about something. And speaking of lying, it would not be until March of 1952 that Patricia Land would finally be tracked down, where she was living in Joplin, Missouri. When authorities found her, she denied any knowledge of this murder, even though she was a primary witness whose common-law husband was the presumed victim. She was obviously trying to deny she was Patricia at all, but she didn't fool anyone. She was brought back to New Orleans and sentenced ultimately to an 18-month sentence for perjury. But long before this, in October of 1951, Sam Jones would be convicted and sentenced to 4 months in prison for his involvement in the robbery. He would be released after 2 months and seemingly remain as a suspect in this murder case. But after this little conviction, Sam Jones's name faded away from the headlines. News articles related to Patricia Land's perjury trial stated that when Jones testified, they felt it best to finally just set him free. And just to add a little extra to the ongoing oddities in this case, in these few articles from the summer of 1952, they stated that Sam Jones's real name was actually John Calvin Harper. I then backtracked and found a couple pieces referring to him by this name, but none from 1949 when he was reportedly killed. Nothing in this story came easy. If you ask me, it's difficult to argue Sam Jones's innocence in this murder case. His confession didn't hold water, and he did still split town, something Donald Easterwood didn't do. He either moronically admitted to doing something he wasn't involved in, or he lied about something that he was involved in. The victim found in the swamp was no accident. And as far as Easterwood is concerned, I don't know what to think, because his whole involvement hedges on whether one believes his confession was beaten out of him. And as quickly as Jones made his accident confession, Easterwood stopped appearing in the press as a suspect. It seems he was officially set free, like Jones was. It's funny to think, in the end, the person who did the most time in prison for all of this was Patricia Land. And Ernest Howard is even harder to know. His guilt also hinges on Easterwood's confession. Sam Jones remains the strongest suspect. We know a robbery took place, a crime which Donald Easterwood was never charged for, but Jones was. Jones admitted to it. I feel like the strongest theory in this case is that Jones probably came up with this robbery scheme on his own, possibly with Easterwood's involvement, and in his efforts, someone arrived on the scene, maybe a customer, maybe someone who could be a possible witness to the crime. A scuffle may have ensued, or perhaps a direct attack by Jones, in which he killed the man found with multiple stab wounds. Patricia Land may have been there with him, maybe not, but in this scenario, I feel that she at least knew most of what happened, if not being a direct witness. In the aftermath, then, not only did Jones leave town, but so did Land, at least after she committed perjury at Easterwood's trial. Jones probably figured he got away with it, but when he was found, he figured cooperation with authorities would probably be the best way to protect himself. So he came back willingly, admitted to the robbery, and then put together an account of how the man died that, unfortunately for him, did not line up with the wounds the victim received. And fortunately for him, in the end, he only did a couple months for robbery. Now that's just one theory. And there remains one more mystery, perhaps explaining why Jones and Easterwood were let go so easily, and why no others were arrested or tried for this crime. See, after the body was recovered from the swamp and assumed to be Sam Jones, he was passively buried in a potter's field in an unmarked grave. When Jones was found alive, there was immediate orders to exhume the victim's remains to try and identify them. The problem was, nobody could seem to remember exactly where the body had been buried. Being an unmarked grave only made it harder. The body had also been buried for over 2 years, so the burial wasn't fresh. The search effort was so unsuccessful to find these remains that the FBI was eventually called in to help in the search. They too could not find it. By the last articles written on this case, mostly focused on the Land perjury trial in 1952, it was still periodically noted that the victim's grave had still yet to be found. I found no evidence afterward that the remains were ever discovered, and with the victim's identity unknown, and with potter's fields often being packed with unmarked graves, how would anyone be able to identify any particular set of human remains as the victim? The only way to know for certain would be to know for certain where the victim was buried and who they were. I hardly see then how this mystery of the victim's identity could ever be solved. So who was he? Well, I feel we can eliminate a few possibilities. For example, the victim likely wasn't a coworker of Jones's, as such a person going missing would immediately grab the police's attention. I also doubt it was someone close to Jones, as once he was found alive, such people would be looked into to see if they were alive and well. But beyond that, the mystery of who was actually killed in this story literally went to the grave with him.